Hey, welcome back. I'm Sean Barr, and at Looking Point, we help IT organizations make decisions around collaboration, security, and networking. We're going to be going through today the top 3 questions that we received from our viewers around Cisco ISE. But before we jump into it, if you're not subscribed to our channel, make sure you hit subscribe so you get all of our content notifications as we release it. And this is a Tech Talk. All right, we're back, and we are talking Cisco ISE. Now, we've received a number of questions, and we took the top 3 questions that we've seen the most. The first question is, what is Cisco ISE? The second question is, how do I install Cisco ISE? And the third question is, how do I reboot the Cisco ISE server? So we're going to answer all 3 of those questions. And I'm going to bring in Dominic, who's an engineer on our team, to take us through those specific questions and how we can step through them and answer those questions. So let's hop in and bring Dominic in via WebEx. All right, Dominic, thanks for joining. We're talking ISE today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sean. It's always good to be here.
Absolutely. So we're talking about what is ISE was one of the questions that we got a lot of, obviously, people that write in questions. And the first question that we had was, what is ISE? So we thought we would just cover that, at a high level. What is ISE and why would a customer want it?
Yeah, sure. Good question. So I think customers may be familiar with radius servers. So they may have heard of Cisco ACS. They may have heard of Microsoft NPS. So ISE is a next generation of those types of applications. Those applications were largely just radius authentication servers, right? So if devices were connecting to your network, you wanted to make sure they authenticated before they get on. You would send those authentication requests to a radius server. So ISE is that, at a bare minimum, a radius authentication server. But additionally, it falls into a category of products known as network access control appliances. So on top of just authenticating devices onto the network, you could do really advanced things to ensure a device complies with your security policy. You can make sure only approved software is running on the endpoints when they connect. You can make sure that it's got firewall turned on when it connects. You can make sure that it's connecting during a certain time of day that's permissible. So you can do really advanced policies to control access to your network with Cisco ISE.
So it's an authentication source and also a policy enforcement product.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And a radius server essentially would integrate with some other directory service like Active Directory for username and password storage. And ISE does that too, right? Or LDAP, I guess?
Yep. Yeah, so ISE can integrate generically with identity stores, right? So those identity stores contain information about the users or computers that are going to authenticate onto the network. So most commonly, ISE is joined to an Active Directory domain as that identity store. But you can connect to a generic LDAP server. You can connect to a ODBC database server. A common way to authenticate users and endpoints onto the network is to combine certificate authentication with an identity lookup from an identity store. So, for instance, I may have an internal PKI from Microsoft, and I issue certificates down to all of my endpoints. I configure ISE to trust those certificates, so trust that internal PKI for client authentication. ISE will receive that cert from an endpoint. It'll look up a username, pull a username from that cert. After it checks to make sure the cert's valid, doing all the normal things, we're within the validity period, I trust the issuer, it has the client authentication EKU, then I'm going to pull that username and I'm going to look it up in that identity store. So if I've disabled this account in AD, for instance, even though it presented me a good cert, I'm not going to allow the device to connect to the network. So kind of add some functionality onto your typical authentication.
Nice. And ISE would be used with either wired networks or wireless networks to authenticate access. VPN clients, right? ISE could be used to authenticate those clients coming in. Is there any other main use case for ISE, like for points of access?
Yeah, so those are the main ones. So wired, wireless, and VPN, those are the three places that endpoints connect to your network, right, to gain access. If you could think of a fourth one, I would love to know what that is. But so those are the three places people are getting onto your network. People and things are getting onto your network. So ISE enforces that edge to make sure only the things you want on your network, the users you want, are getting on. That's the main use case for ISE. There are a couple other ones. So now with the latest release of Firepower Threat Defense and Firepower Management Center, if you're familiar with those products, they were able to do user ID lookup, so you could write policies based on user ID instead of just source destination IP. So there used to be I forget the name right now, but there was a legacy user agent for Firepower, and that has been end of life in the most current release. So Firepower now relies on getting that user ID information from ISE. So even if you are not deploying authentication on your wired, wireless, or VPN networks, pointing it to ISE, which you should be, but even if you weren't, there are customers that deploy ISE in a kind of a passive mode. They call it ISE PIC, and I think that actually stands for Passive Identity Collector, to get that username to IP mapping, share that information with Firepower Management Center so that you can write your firewall policies based on user information as opposed to just IP address information. So there are a couple other use cases. ISE also has a PX Grid API, so Platform Exchange Grid is what that stands for, and that's ISE's ecosystem integration, right? So there are other vendors and security products out there that support connecting to PX Grid as a client. So what PX Grid is designed for is to share security context information with these third-party vendors. So if for instance I was deploying Splunk and I was getting IP addresses fed into Splunk and all the syslog messages coming from various network devices, and I wanted to map user information to those IP addresses, Splunk could integrate with ISE through PX Grid, pull that user to IP mapping, and present a more rich data set to the Splunk administrator.
Oh, that's pretty awesome. I learned some things around the user mapping, so that data becomes more real to a user instead of some IP in a VPN pool.
Yeah, totally.
Awesome. So the next question I have for you around ISE is, we get a lot of questions around just general deployment, general installation. Can you take us through what, a general ISE deployment would look like, what the method is to install it?
Yeah. So forgetting about the size of the deployment for a moment, so if you're doing 1 node, 2 nodes, or 50 nodes, just the general process of getting to the GUI, right? So I can start doing things with ISE will first depend on whether or not you're deploying a physical appliance, right? So I bought the hardware from Cisco, or if I'm deploying a virtual appliance. So I'm bringing my own compute and I'm spinning up a VM running ISE. So in the former, where I bought the hardware appliance from Cisco, it's going to come pre-installed with a version of ISE that was generally available at the time of the purchase. More often than not, you buy the hardware, and by the time it gets to you and you're ready to deploy, it's a month or two later. There's probably a new software rev. So I generally just start by re-imaging those ISE appliances with the base release that I want to deploy on. And you can only install ISE on the base release, right? So the way ISE software revisions work is they release a base, like 2.7.0, for instance. And then they'll patch from there. We patch 1, patch 2, so on and so forth. And those patches are cumulative, I think is the right word. So patch 7 includes everything patch 6 did, patch 5 did, patch 4, 3, 2, and 1. So ultimately, you want to install the base release, and that's what you'll install using an ISO image in the hardware appliance. It's a Cisco UCS server, right? So we'll connect to that Cisco Integrated Management Controller. We'll launch that virtual KVM. We'll map that ISO image, and we'll boot to it and let the base release install. There's a setup wizard that we'll walk through where we'll input host name, IP info, DNS servers, NTP servers, and create our first user account. After you enter that setup wizard and the server reboots, you'll be able to log into the GUI, and from there, away you go.
Awesome. No, that's exactly what I was looking for. I think that's what people are looking for, is just where do they start. And you mentioned mostly hardware appliance. Can ISE be deployed in a virtual environment like VMware?
Yeah. So VMware, Hyper-V, KVM, pretty much everywhere except cloud native right now.
Okay.
So there's no native AWS image. There's no native Azure image. There's no Google one either. So as of release 3.0 in ISE, you can deploy in VMware on top of AWS or VMware on top of Azure. I hear it's a pretty pricey solution to run VMware in those clouds, but it is an option now for those customers who have to have it running in AWS or Azure. And the install process is largely the same, except instead of connecting to the Cisco Integrated Management Controller to install the software, you're going to be connecting to whatever your hypervisor product is to install the software. And then you can still use the ISO file to install the virtual appliance. You'd have to make sure you got the compute and the CPU and the memory and the disk size correct to match the supported OVA size that you're trying to deploy if you were going to install from the ISO. But also, as opposed to installing from the ISO, Cisco provides the OVA, which is the whole shebang, right? So it's got the OS and application included in the OVA file with the correct specs based on the size of OVA that you chose. So you can just download the OVA, load that up into your hypervisor, tell it to install the OVA, and it'll boot up to that setup wizard screen where we walk through entering the basic network information, reboot, and GUI pops up. And again, both of those methods take you to the base version of whatever release you installed. So 2.7.0. Once I get into that GUI, from there, I can use the GUI to simply apply the latest patch for that release, which is generally recommended. It's always nice to be running the latest patch.
Yeah, especially if you're building from scratch, you may as well patch it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Patch it up. All right, so the last question I have around ISE is around how do you reboot this thing? That's another question that we've seen a lot, is just, hey, how do I reboot the ISE infrastructure? Or, I mean, maybe we should just talk about a single server, and you could do that on multiple servers, but how do you reboot the server?
Yeah, I mean, on the surface, that seems like a silly question, but I can understand. I can understand why somebody would be asking it.
So you're saying you don't just walk over and hit the power button like?
Yeah, it's a little more than that, right? So if somebody were looking at ISE, right, this is what they would see. If I was an administrator, I probably had I may not have installed it myself. I may have just been given the credentials and given the URL to go to, right? So this is all I ever see of ISE, is I live in this GUI. And you'll hunt in here forever trying to figure out, okay, how do I reboot this thing? No, not there. You can't reboot this thing from inside the GUI. So that's why the question kind of makes sense, and I won't give the person who asked it such a hard time. So
I'd be like, you just reboot, but that's me because I didn't know it was that hard.
Yeah. So what they're aside from the GUI, or in addition to the GUI, there's a shell, right? So by default, ISE enables shell access to the application server. Let's see here. So we'll get in to this ISE node, ISE pan 1 lookingpoint.com, and put in the super secret password. So this is ISE, and you'll notice if you're familiar with operating a router or a switch running iOS, there's a lot of crossover here. So this is actually ADE-OS, ADE-OS, and I forget what that stands for. It's like Application Deployment Environment OS, something like that. It's I think Cisco developed it. So you can do show run in here, right? Like you're used to. take a look at all the settings here. This is stuff we would configure in routers and switches, right? Pretty standard stuff. We can configure SNMP strings in here, our NTP servers, our name servers, etc. And then there's a command set show application. So we can just use our question mark here to get context for completing a command, just like you can in iOS. So we can show application version. ISE, you got to specify the application. That's another point. So it's ADEOS. It was just a generic application operating system, right? And then Cisco has, over the course of time, deployed a few different applications on top of it, ISE being one of them. And I think the last remaining one that I'm aware of that they deploy on top of ADEOS, they used this OS for Prime, their Prime application deployments. They sat on top of ADEOS as well. So that's why we have to plug in the application name here, because this is not, or originally was not purpose-built for ISE. So we can take a look at the version ISE is running. Here we're a couple minor versions behind in our lab. So we're running 2.4. And then the command most people run when they come into the CLI is show application, not version status, ISE. This will show you all of the processes that are running as a part of the ISE application. And rather than go through all of the processes, I'll clue you into the main process, right? So application server. So if this is not running, your ISE node is not working. The other way that I use the status of this process is to determine after a reboot when the GUI is ready for me, right? Because I'm going to reboot this thing, and it's going to take about 10 minutes to kick on all these services. This service is going to be the last one to start, the application server. And the web server runs as part of this application server process. So while this is still initializing, you won't be able to log into the GUI, only once you see this thing running. So there are a couple different ways, right, to restart things on ISE depending on what you're trying to do. If all I want to do is restart the application services, then I can enter the command application stop ISE. And what that effectively is going to do is kill all these services that are running here. So maybe I'm running into some sort of issue on ISE as a first step in troubleshooting, rather than reboot the whole node, is I just want to bounce the application services to see if I can get through whatever it is I'm up against. This would be the command to run.
I mean, it appears to take a little bit.
All right, so it takes about 3 minutes for all these processes to stop. And then when you start them up again, you're looking at 5 to 10 minutes before they're fully functional.
And I could see how it could really be an issue if it's a physical box, like an ISE appliance, and you don't have VMware access, because I was thinking VMware, you just hit restart or stop the machine, start it back up. Obviously, that's not an elegant way to do it, but you could do that. But if it's in a data center somewhere and you're remotely managing it and you're trying to reboot the ISE node, it may not be as easy as you think.
Yeah, so you always want to, if it's a VM, you always want to ask your systems team to at least give you access into vCenter to manage this VM, so that in the event of an emergency, you can get in there yourself, restart the VM if the CLI isn't even responding, because there are cases where you can't get to the CLI depending on what kind of problem you're up against, right? So having that console or that out-of-band type management access that vCenter would give you to the VM, if we're talking about VMware, or CIMC, Cisco Integrated Management Controller, would give you to the hardware appliance, we're talking about that, is critical in any deployment. Is that ensures you have an out-of-band means to get to the box and reboot it in some unforeseen situation.
Nice.
All right, so here we've got all the services stopped. So say I wanted to bring them back up. What do you think I'd type instead of stop?
Start.
You got it.
Man, I'm like an ICE wizard over here.
There you go. So this will take a little longer to start these services up.
So we cut out a little bit of time here, but this took about 5 minutes, right, to start up?
Took about 5 minutes to start up, and then we can run that same command to see, hey, is this thing ready for us yet? Right? Is the GUI ready for me? And I'm going to guess no. I'm going to think we have kicked off the process to start the processes. Those processes themselves are going to run through their rigmarole until they're ready for us. Initializing, right? So this is where we're not going to find any joy trying to connect to the GUI right now.
Yeah.
Right? You want this guy running. That's your clue that ICE is ready for you.
I like that.
And you can do what you're going to do.
You do you.
You do you. All right. So now that we're running, we should be able to log into our GUI again here. Joy.
We're
back up. So let's say now this didn't fix our problem. We still have the same issue we're up against, and we want to fully reload the box. So we've got a couple options, right? So this happens to be a virtual appliance. So I could log into my vCenter console and come into my VM. You can see it's running VMware tools here. So I can take the guest OS actions, right? So I can restart my guest OS. Now, what I've found is that if I come into the hypervisor and I restart the guest OS, it doesn't gracefully shut down the processes. When I do this, it just restarts the OS. So anytime you're able to shut down those processes gracefully, you want to do it. So as a best practice, before you come in and restart via CIMC, if it's a hardware appliance, or via vCenter, if it's a VMware virtual machine, you always want to do the reload through the CLI. And you're going to do this by issuing that classic reload command that we all like. And there you go. See, I wasn't lying to you. It's running ADOS. So do we want to save the configuration? Yep. And do we want to continue with reboot? Yep. And doing it this way will gracefully stop the services before it reloads the appliance. So this is always going to be the preferred way to reload an ICE appliance.
Nice.
Now you could take that in 2 steps just to be extra careful, right? I could do application stop ICE, wait for the services to stop, and then go into a reload. But this reload command should do that for you as well.
Cool. So to recap, we covered 3 commands. The status command, which was the show application ICE status. Was that right? Or show application
show
status?
Application status. Show application status ICE.
Okay. And then we had application start ICE and application stop ICE. Right?
You got it.
And then
application start, application stop, and show application status. Yep.
Got it. And then the reload is it's gone.
Reload.
And then we talked about the VMware, but I think the real tips that you want to translate to people is you got to pump the console and running the status command over and over and over.
Pump the console.
We'll make it load faster. Those are jokes. Those last 2 ones are jokes. Not very funny, but
I mean, you could try them. You could try them though. I mean, it's not going to hurt anything.
Oh, it will not hurt. It may make the time feel faster. Essentially, right after that, we'd come back in, we'd show status, and wait till the GUI loads, and then you'd be back into ICE.
Yeah, you got it.
That's awesome.
You got it.
I appreciate you taking us through that. Thanks, Dom. Thanks for being here. Thanks for giving us all the ICE knowledge.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
All right. Awesome. All right, so we just got done with Dominic. We covered all three of those topics that we discussed. I hope that you learned something from it today, and if there's anything that we said in this video or anything we didn't cover in this video that you wish we did, make sure you leave a comment, make sure you like and subscribe so you get all of our content as we release it, and we will see you on the next Tech Talk. Thanks for watching.